Is religion totalitarian in its impulses? Does it assault human integrity, claiming that we cannot ourselves work out right from wrong? These are the arguments put by the visiting writer Christopher Hitchens, who goes beyond agnosticism to a sort of muscular anti-theism. On Saturday night, he gives the opening address at the Opera House's Festival of Dangerous Ideas, no doubt drawing on his book, which is currently in bookstores, called God is Not Great. His title for Saturday night certainly doesn't muck around. It's Religion Poisons Everything. And Christopher Hitchens joins us in the studio. Good afternoon.
Hey, thank you.
Why don't you tell us what you really think?
By the way, you meant to say fine bookstores everywhere.
Fine bookstores everywhere.
God is Not Great and excellent newspaper.
Why don't you tell us what you really think? Religion poisons everything.
Yes, I mean, and people say, do you really mean it poisons, I don't know, tantric sex, Chinese food, chess, and so on? In the sense that it poisons the original well, yes, it does. It says that we are essentially slaves, that we belong to a celestial dictator who has the power to bind or loose us, and without whom we wouldn't have the knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong. We've no moral integrity of our own, in other words. A terrific assault on our whole self-respect, and with the implication that you kindly mentioned yourself, that this is a father who won't go away. Now, picture a parent who won't quit. Picture a parent who says, never mind, don't worry about me. It's not you won't have to worry, not you won't have to be at my funeral. I'll be at yours. I'll be at your children's funeral too. I'm never leaving. This is much, much worse than the famously obscene and horrifying totalitarian concept of the big brother. I think we'd be better off without it. The second thing I want to say, if I can just be quick, is to emphasize that everything we know now about the cosmos shows us how little we know about it. Everything we know about our own DNA and our own nature and makeup, though it's a great deal more than we used to know, as with the cosmos, shows us how little we know. The one proposition that's no use to us is to be told we don't need any more knowledge. All of the questions of our salvation were decided 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, depending on which book you like, in remote parts of the Middle East. And knowledge is not important. Faith is important. Reason is not important. Faith is what's necessary. Investigation, inquiry, skepticism, these are nothing compared to the wonders of faith and total dependence. And I think this is just an obscene conclusion.
I guess people of a religious faith say that if you leave everything up to inquiry, as you say, in the moment, then doesn't a value system, truth versus non-truth, good versus evil, doesn't it automatically collapse into a series of competing relativities in which you have your truth and I have my truth, and there's no basis on which either of us can assert our truth over the other?
No, I perfectly agree that that's a danger. And for example, there are people who are atheists like me. Peter Singer is a famous instance, who are relativists and who say that how could you really tell that the life of an insect is more than the life of a child, and so on. That's true, and I have big arguments with utilitarians like him. And I know what my own moral grounding is, but I wouldn't say that I knew it because God had told me. But it's no worse than the religious. In fact, I think it's rather better. The religious don't get away from this problem. They say you are made out of dust, to begin with. Or, if you believe in the Quran, made out of a clot of blood, fashioned from rubbish. That you're the dust beneath the chariot wheels of the dictator, that if I act in the name of God, I can commit any crime I like, killing a child or mutilating its genitals or sacrificing it. Absolutely fine. Not just, as Singer says, no worse than killing an animal, but a beautiful thing to do because you're doing it to please God. Making war on civilians, treating women as chattel. All of this is, Dostoevsky says famously, without God, everything's possible. People could do anything. Well, the corollary holds. With God, with permission that they think is divine, people are capable of much worse than that. So these problems will be with us, whether we're people of faith or not.
I suppose they argue that it's within their own schema, at least they've got something they can point to as a repository of truth. In the case of Christians, for instance, the Bible. Their problem is that if you and I come to different conclusions about good and evil, for instance, in a particular case, on what basis do we assert one argument as being superior to the other? Don't we end up with just an endless series of relativities?
Well, I'm certainly not able to say of any of my beliefs that if someone doesn't share them, they've doomed themselves to eternal punishment, or if they did agree with me, to eternal reward. That is an inducement in one case, or disincentive in another, that I have discarded. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, we're not on the same.
Okay, but you believe in the Great Enlightenment tradition that we can probably sit down, you and I, with the topic abortion, euthanasia, and argue about it in a useful way.
Well, in my book, may I just say, God is Not Great,
available in fine bookstores.
In a very handsome and very inexpensive paperback. I say why I agree with those who think that abortion is a crime. I mean, I think that there is such a thing as an unborn child. That's not a propaganda concept. Everything we know from embryology seems to confirm it more and more, and viability of embryos and fetuses seems to confirm it more and more. It's just that the Catholic position on it makes it nonsensical. It says it's because it has a soul, it's because contraception is just as bad, because it's an interruption of God's will. They say, Mother Teresa used to say, the Church more or less teaches, contraception is roughly morally equivalent. It means it would be using sex for something else than procreation. All this makes it completely nonsensical, rather than saying, look, we as human beings have an interest in the fate and welfare of the occupant of the uterus. It's not just for its own sake, but for ours too.
But to go back to the argument we were having before, you believe that in all these different discourses you can base it on rational argument and build up a rational case, which you will...
Well, I would like to think yes, because then, after I'm not a pacifist, I don't think that because it's a life it can't be taken. I mean, there are many cases, almost all rational argument, including a lot of religious argument, or rather excluding, but embracing it, is under what conditions may you do what appears to be a violation of the commandment, such as, say, commit a murder or take a life. Well, this applies also if you think that the unborn are alive, or potentially alive, or are human. Well, it doesn't mean there are no circumstances where, but their lives cannot be taken, or that uterus can't be evacuated. But it gets you nowhere to say we have a divine order under which we have to operate here.
Now, you mentioned pacifism. I guess that's the other famous thing about you, or infamous thing about you, a person from the tradition of the left who ended up supporting the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Explain why you did that and why you continue to do it.
Well, you say supporting the war, and of course I know what you mean, and I'm not trying to duck it, but there's been fighting going on in these countries for quite a long time. Indeed, a lot worse before the intervention by this country, the United Kingdom and the US most noticeably, which actually has led to, I think, less fighting, less violence, and certainly less of it being controlled by local...
You're talking about Afghanistan now.
And Iraq. Yeah. And less violence, and less of it determined by the presence of local theocratic and or fascistic...
The amount of violence...
aggressive genocidal regimes.
The amount of violence in Iraq, although considerable under Saddam Hussein, surely grew after the invasion, didn't it?
I would take out the word surely. I mean, or if it grew, I would, you may think I'm having it both ways, but I think I could argue for it, say it's still because of its post hoc propter hoc. I mean, a huge store of violence was being built up by the Saddam Hussein regime, which, operated by divide and rule tactics that increased hatred between Sunni and Shia, Arab and Kurd, and so forth, constantly threatening its neighbors, particularly Iran, but also Kuwait, using chemical and other weapons of mass destruction within its own borders and outside them, storing up what I think would have been a Rwanda on the Gulf, or a Congo on the Gulf, if we hadn't intervened.
Yes, although all those things you say, which may well be true, weren't the prime reason. And the prime reason seemed to be this sleight of hand, whereby they were blamed for September 11.
No, they weren't blamed exactly for September 11th. There was an allegation that's at least partly true, that Iraq had shifted from being, as Syria under the Baathists has shifted from being a secular country, a secular regime, to one that has working alliances with religious fundamentalists. And you can see it with the Syrians, who are just as Baathist as Saddam was. Their main proxy party is Hezbollah, and their main foreign ally is Iran.
But it was more secular.